Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're looking at a genuinely provocative theological thesis. What if modern believers are literally missing out on their absolute most crucial asset? We are doing a deep dive into the concept of spiritual gifts, and in this explainer, we're going to give you a clear, objective, and step-by-step breakdown of how these empowerments are understood in the source material. We'll examine exactly what the original speaker argues these gifts actually are, why they emphatically claim that mere salvation just isn't enough to sustain a thriving community, and how they suggest these abilities are acquired in the real world.
So we have a highly structured journey ahead of us. We'll start by understanding spiritual gifts. Then we'll contrast them with salvation. From there, we're going to look at a great toolbox analogy, explore how to actually cultivate these gifts, and finally, look at their real-world impact on the church.
All right, Section 1. Understanding spiritual gifts, defining the divine.
According to the presentation we're analyzing, spiritual gifts, or untu tainling, are not just random magical talents handed out so an individual can feel special or elevated above everybody else. The speaker defines them very specifically as divine empowerments bestowed upon believers for a highly active communal purpose. Think of them as tools specifically designed for practical ministry, much like building bridges between divided people in a community. They're essential for managing grace, functioning almost like synchronized gears turning together to keep a complex system moving smoothly. And most importantly, they are for serving the needs of others. The source emphasizes that whether these abilities manifest as something supernatural or something highly practical, they are ultimately tools for community building. If a gift doesn't end up expressing love and actively serving someone else, well, the speaker argues it essentially becomes meaningless.
Let's move to Section 2, Salvation versus Gifts, the core contrast.
Now what's really interesting here is the stark contrast between basic salvation and spiritual gifts. The speaker identifies blurring these two as a critical theological misunderstanding today. So think about salvation. It's described as a gift of grace. The speaker notes it requires only faith, just believing and accepting. In that sense, it's relatively easy and passive to receive. It's often thought of as something peaceful and freely given, fundamentally about your personal spiritual destination. But spiritual gifts? They are a completely different story. The source insists you don't just automatically get these gifts the moment you become a believer. Instead, they require an intense, almost overwhelming desire. They demand active pursuit. The speaker uses words describing a deep hunger and a relentless chase. It's less like a peaceful dove landing on your shoulder, and more like the intense effort of pushing through a fire. You're being empowered for service. And the argument is that the divine simply doesn't force these heavy, impactful tools onto someone who's too indifferent to genuinely want them.
Which brings us to Section 3. The toolbox analogy, equipping the believer.
The presentation uses a brilliantly grounded, everyday metaphor to explain the diversity of these gifts. The quote is, "You are like a mechanic. You cannot fix electricity with just a screwdriver." The speaker points out that trying to do complex spiritual or community work with just basic salvation is like trying to fix an entire car with one single tool. It's inefficient and, frankly, kind of ridiculous. A mechanic needs a hammer, a chisel, pliers, a whole array of specific tools for highly specific, complex problems. In the exact same way, the source argues that possessing just one single gift, or operating with none at all, is completely insufficient for a believer who actually wants to make a real, tangible impact in an incredibly complex world.
So what exactly is inside this spiritual toolkit? The speaker lists several fascinating tools ranging from the highly supernatural right down to the incredibly practical. You have wisdom and knowledge, which they describe as the ability to speak the exact right words to pull someone out of deep depression or confusion. There's radical faith, healing, and miracles. But check out these last 2 points, because the speaker highlights some highly specific, unexpected traits here. Intercession, for example, is described by the speaker as the gift of being a deeply trustworthy, secretive listener. Someone people naturally want to confess their darkest burdens to, because they intrinsically know their secrets are safe. And, fascinatingly, generating wealth is also explicitly listed as a spiritual gift. It's having the specific divine talent to make money successfully, not for personal luxury, but specifically so you have the resources to donate, care for the sick, and financially support the community's mission.
Moving right along to Section 4, How to Cultivate Gifts, the Path to Empowerment. So if we know what the tools are, the next logical question is, how do we actually get them? The presentation offers a very clear roadmap, proving that acquiring these gifts isn't just some mystical lottery. The source outlines a strict 3-step progression. Step 1, as we discussed, is intense desire. You literally must genuinely want to be equipped from the inside out. Step 2 is incredibly practical. Serve with love. The speaker argues you must faithfully use whatever basic talents you already have, managing your current, mundane responsibilities well before you're ever trusted with heavier, divine tools. Basically, you have to be willing to get off the couch and help someone. And step 3 is respond to the Spirit. This requires active engagement. You can't just be a spectator. The speaker insists that believers must actively respond during sermons, worship, and study. Essentially, you're positioning yourself to catch the gifts that are being poured out by leaders who already possess them.
And finally, Section 5, Impact on the Church, the Problem and the Solution. Here, the presentation poses a really blunt, real-world problem. Why are some modern churches completely stagnating? I mean, why does it take months or even a whole year of exhausting effort just to see a handful of new converts join a congregation? The speaker argues that institutions relying entirely on basic human effort and comfortable traditions are hitting a massive wall, and they need to reevaluate their entire approach to empowerment.
Because the cost of lacking these spiritual tools is absolutely severe, according to the source. Without the gift of discernment, congregations are like sheep exposed to wolves in sheep's clothing. They become extremely vulnerable to false teachings and manipulative cults that prey on passive members. There's also a glaring inability to solve real-world problems. If someone comes into the community deeply suffering and leaders only have basic words of comfort without the actual power to help them, they'll simply leave. Furthermore, trying to move the massive boulder of community growth using only human strength, it just leads to an empty battery and severe pastoral burnout. Ultimately, the speaker warns that without these gifts, believers just become powerless Sunday-only attendees. They're filling a seat to hit a weekly attendance quota, but entirely lacking the dynamic, world-changing impacts they were supposedly designed for. To validate this whole framework, the speaker walks us through a really compelling historical case study, the early church. They argue that massive faith expansion was originally catalyzed by visible miracles, not just exceptionally good preaching. It follows a clear progression. It starts with Jesus' ministry. The speaker notes his very first act was turning water to wine, a tangible miracle to prove his authority before just preaching empty words. Then consider the upper room, where Peter led a meager 40 followers. Suddenly, they receive the gift of tongues. And the speaker shares a striking personal anecdote here. They talk about how they themselves struggled for over a decade just to learn basic conversational English. Yet these early believers instantly and flawlessly spoke complex foreign languages they had never even studied. It was this undeniable, visible miracle that caught the public's attention and directly fueled the rapid mass conversions that instantly followed.
To further emphasize this incredible transformation, the speaker asks us to contrast two distinct states of the exact same historical figure. Think about Peter the fisherman, an ordinary, uneducated laborer with incredibly limited societal influence. But then, fully equipped with spiritual gifts, he becomes Peter the apostle. The source notes that the public was absolutely stunned because this uneducated fisherman was suddenly speaking with profound, undeniable wisdom and performing physical miracles right there in the streets. The core argument here is that the gifts are the necessary bridge between ordinary human limitation and extraordinary historical impact. They are the great equalizer.
The explainer also highlights the Apostle Paul to show how these gifts fundamentally optimize human effort. Paul didn't just wander around the ancient world preaching randomly wherever he felt like it. The source points out that his specific travel paths and ministry targets were entirely directed by the Spirit. And the speaker brilliantly likens this to having a CEO hand you a flawless, pre-written business plan versus making you figure out a corporate strategy by blind trial and error. By utilizing the gift of divine guidance, Paul ensured maximum effectiveness, seamlessly bypassing resistant audiences and reaching exactly those who are ready to listen, entirely eliminating wasted human effort and all the massive frustration that comes with it.
Which leads us to one of the speaker's boldest and most fascinating conclusions. They suggest that when the standard message of faith is paired directly with actual visible miracles or the undeniable operation of these spiritual gifts, the conviction rate jumps to essentially 100%. This source argues that mere words and philosophies, well, they can be debated for hours. But when a profound human problem is tangibly solved through a spiritual gift, like a broken chain suddenly being snapped, the intellectual resistance simply melts away.
And that brings us to our final thought for today. The original presentation isn't just some academic, theological lecture meant to be passively consumed. It's a direct, urgent challenge. It forces the listener to look at their own spiritual life and ask, are you merely attending, filling a seat, and relying entirely on basic salvation, or are you truly pursuing the necessary tools required to make a tangible impact? Are you truly equipped to serve your community? It's a fascinating perspective on capability, divine empowerment, and the true purpose of faith. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. I hope this explainer has provided you with a really solid, structured understanding of this complex theological framework. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next analysis.